Sometimes you might test on several pages simultaneously, but not every page has the element you test on, or certain conditions apply, like whether a user is logged in or not. In such cases, you can use if statements. If you checked out the jQuery lesson, then this will be familiar. The if statement is the same for jQuery and native JavaScript. An if statement is written like this. It starts with if, then there is a certain condition, then a block of code to be executed if the condition is true, and else we get a block of code to be executed if the condition is false. If you don't want to do anything when the condition is false, you can simply remove this piece of code. This will also work. Let's write a code to check if the h1 equals 0 tips and book. If so, we change the font size to 14 pixels. For the condition, we use the query selector. And of course, we get the h1. And we want to check the text, so text content. Now in this case, we need two equal symbols. If you want more information on equal to, contains, is not, and other options, check out this page on W3 Schools. You can find a link to it in the resources of this lecture. So we want to check if the text content equals 0 tips and book. And if this is true, we will for now add a console log stating 0 tips. And let's hit enter. There we go. We get the console log. So this statement, the if statement, is true. The text does contain 0 tips and book. Now let's change the font size. Let's reuse the code. Remove this. We will select the h1 again. Use the style method, and we change the font size to 12 pixels. Enter, and that works. Let's clear this, reuse the code, and now we'll also add an else statement. Shift enter, and we will again get the query selector of the h1 and set the style, and let's do text decoration, and we set it to underline. And don't forget the closing curly bracket. Hit enter, and now nothing happens because the h1 is 0 tips and book. So this condition is true, and therefore the font size is set to 12 pixels. But when we run this code on this page, the online 0 courses page, we'll clear this, reuse the code, and now the h1 is underlined. Because this statement is false, the text is not 0 tips and book, thus the else statement is applied. Sometimes you might want to check if an element exists on the page, and if so, apply some code. Let's clear it. Start with the if statement. Use the query selector again. We will select the h1 and write an exclamation mark equals null. An exclamation mark and equals means it is not equal to. And when the h1 does not exist, it will return null. So in this case, we get the h1 and it is not null, meaning it does exist. So let's add a console log with the text h1 exists. Closing curly bracket, and else we do a console log h1 does not exist, and a closing curly bracket. So if the h1 is not null, meaning there is an h1 on the page, we get the console log h1 exists. Else, we get the console log h1 does not exist. Let's try this out. We now get h1 exists because there's an h1 on the page. Now let's test it on my home page. Reuse the code, hit enter, and now we get h1 does not exist. And that is indeed true, because when we check out the HTML, we see that this is an h2 and there's no h1 on the page. So, with if statements, you can check if certain conditions are met and then apply your JavaScript. You start with if, followed by a condition and the curly brackets. And again, you can use this page to get more information about equals to, contains, and is not equal to.